Most people are not super wealthy, but we all have an idea of what it might be like to be a wealthy person. We watch them on TV, we follow them on Instagram, we read their blogs and autobiographies. Unfortunately, that awareness of how the other half lives doesn't happen much in the other direction.
Something that I hope they cover here, since they just referenced all these like media segments or ways that we might learn about how richer individuals live their lives. I think one of the things that stands out to me is how disingenuous many of those sources are. So like if you think about social media or TV shows, etc., many of these people are incentivized to make you believe that they are richer than what they really are. And in some cases, this is like a fake it till you make it scenario. Obviously, I think probably the best example I can think of is probably like Trump, who went out of his way to get himself on kind of, I think it was like the billionaires list before he actually became a billionaire. And he did this to get notoriety and for people to believe that he was successful. And then this actually like paved the way to him being more and more successful over time, because he set up the image of him being successful and then he rode that image to success eventually. And I feel like a lot of social media does this exact same thing, where some people will try to portray that they are better off than they are, or maybe they believe that if they will portray it long enough, then eventually that will become true or it will become reality or something along those lines. And it can lead a lot of people down like these paths to financial ruin, which is very unfortunate. And so maybe they'll cover that, but I thought it was worth calling out just because this has happened so prevalently that you are likely thinking about maybe friends or acquaintances that you know of, or famous social media people who are talking about how they have all these millions of dollars and like they're flying private jets like every other week or whatever it is that they're telling you. And it's likely not true. There is some people who are that rich and potentially could do those things. But the number of people who are really doing that in any extended period of time is such a small number. And there's such a high number of people who are doing that, even infrequently, that are either people who saved up or had like a windfall that they did it, and or they're faking it and or scamming somebody related to this. So I would just put a word of caution there on trying to compare yourself to how wealthy you think other people are, because sometimes those people aren't as wealthy as you think they are.
Though many of us have probably described ourselves as broke or poor at one point or another, very few have an understanding of what real poverty feels like.
And it's not just a matter of having less money. Once you get below a certain threshold, a whole new set of rules apply that actually make day-to-day life more expensive. If you've never struggled with real poverty, you might not be aware of the many hidden costs and financial traps that conspire to keep poor people poor.
It's very hard to make your way through modern life without access to basic financial services like checking accounts, ATMs, and personal checks. But the less money you have, the more these things will cost you. That's because banks make their profits by accruing interest on your money. So if your account balance is too low, usually under $1,500, they won't consider you a profitable client anymore, and they'll make you pay for their basic services in the form of a monthly fee.
And heaven help you if you go below zero. Each overdraft incurs a charge of about $35, and many banks will deliberately reorder your transactions for the day, from biggest to smallest, to drive you into the red more quickly and rack up as many overdraft fees as possible.
Wow, that's pretty malicious. I've definitely seen overdraft fees and know people who do this, unfortunately, on a fairly regular basis. Which really sucks, because you end up spending this amount of money that you obviously don't have. If you're at zero, paying any money because you don't have money is just going to put you farther and farther into trouble. I've never actually heard or seen this phenomenon where they will like rearrange the transactions to do it this way. That seems potentially illegal, but that's very unfortunate to see. I think this is where you could potentially benefit if you're in this scenario from this transaction issue. There's also some credit cards or training credit cards where you can basically put in some money and then you're basically using it as a debit card of some sort to money that you can't like take in and out on a regular basis. That could be a tool that might be useful for you. Because in this case, if you're over the course of a day or a week hitting a transaction fee multiple times for going below zero, at least have it on a card, like one of these trading cards on a real credit card, because that will put you in even more trouble. But most banks have this. If you ask them about it, it's usually for building credit. And at least I would transform this into like a single transaction. And if you use that card, it would completely stop you from making that purchase if you don't have enough funds in your account. And so that might be something I would recommend for folks who are in this scenario to at least help avoid these situations. Obviously, they gave some random examples here, but obviously, like, you don't need a soda for $1.50. It's actually going to cost you $36.50 or something like that. And that'd be a silly thing to run into, but this is something that unfortunately I know people do somewhat regularly run into, and sometimes they can have like multiple overdraft fees in a month, and that can really, really set you back instead of just trying to hold off for like maybe a month or two to get that money in. And this is one of those things that, again, there's unfortunately probably more that they're going to cover here, but there's a few ways in which you kind of end up in this like negative cycle of not having enough money, and then it keeps spiraling out, kind of like these transaction fees or credit cards, for instance, are a terrible, terrible thing for so many people. Auto loans or other loans in general. So again, hopefully that might be helpful for anyone in this case.
If a bank is willing to extend you credit at all, the terms will be much less favorable than for someone with a rosier financial history. You'll pay more money in interest every month, and any late payments means more penalties and fees.
Even cash can be more expensive if you don't have much of it. If you withdraw $100 from an out-of-network ATM, that $3 fee equates to a 3% service charge. But if you can only afford to take out $20 at a time, you're essentially paying a 15% charge to access your own money.
Taken together, this means that a poor person might end up paying hundreds or thousands of dollars a year for services that wealthier people virtually enjoy for free. It's no wonder then that a lot of low-income people avoid banks altogether. But even that comes at a steep price. Cashing a paycheck without a bank account costs money. Buying a money order to pay your electric bill costs money. And if that bill is due in just a couple days, well, you can either get hit with a late fee or FedEx it, an extra expense that someone with a debit card and an internet connection never has to worry about.
If you think that dealing with credit card debt is bad, thank your lucky stars you've never dealt with a payday or car title lender. These businesses are often the only recourse for people without credit cards, and their interest rates reach upwards of 800% annually.
Not only does it cost more to borrow and spend money, but what you spend it on is often more expensive. If you have to feed a family on a tight budget, buying in bulk at a supermarket is usually the best option, but not one available to many poor people. Even if they had the cash on hand to buy weeks worth of food in one trip, how is someone who depends on public transportation supposed to get it home? On their lap on the bus?
Big food retailers, ones with enough purchasing power to offer low prices, are notorious for avoiding poor neighborhoods, and people who live in these so-called food deserts often lack the mobility to cruise around town bargain hunting. Instead, they're stuck with local convenience and corner stores whose prices are much higher. Or they rely on fast food, which can seem cheap in comparison, but is actually more expensive than cooking at home, to say nothing of the long-term health risks.
Rent can also be more.
Before they progress onto other areas, again, for something that might be useful here, I would definitely encourage, if anyone's in that scenario as well, try reaching out to like your local government, like City Hall or something like that. Try to find resources. Some areas have like food banks or areas where they'll give food out on a regular basis, like churches will also do this once in a while. Sometimes they'll either give you like a reduced price, or they'll just give you like a meal for free or groceries for free in some of these cases. And so this would definitely be something that I would encourage folks to look into. If that's the situation you're in, that's definitely a tough situation to be in general. But there are some resources that are available to you. Obviously, it might feel bad to do some of those things. I know like waiting in line to get free food somewhere that they're giving out to like the poor or needy is obviously not something that people feel great about. But sometimes it's something that you got to do. And so if you are in that scenario, and especially like if you have a family or something like that, it's definitely not worthwhile to like keep buying from a convenience store if that's just going to keep hurting you. And one of the worst things that can happen is when you're doing multiple of these things that they've mentioned in a row. So like if you're getting overage fees, or you're getting issues with like your credit card payments or payday loans, and also like your groceries, this is where like all these things kind of spiral out into a real big problem. And so at least if you can curb each of these a tiny bit just for a while to kind of get yourself a little bit of money to hold off onto, like for the transaction fees or for the overage fees, this is where like you're spending a lot of money because you don't have quite enough. But if you could even save sometimes like 10, 20, 30, 50, $100, that could be enough for you to avoid that transaction fee or that overage fee. And then boom, that's like $6, $10, $30 that you saved from not having to pay for that fee. And then that will build up over time, even if it's not that much. And I see a lot of folks who are in tough situations where they basically tell themselves like, what's the point? Like, what if I can't save $100? So like, why would I bother saving $1 or a penny or 10 cents? And I think that's definitely a tough situation to be in. But if you can save a penny, like save that penny. Like that's going to help you just be a penny better off. And if you can save a penny a month, even if it's a year, like that would be enough for you to slowly get out of some of these issues, and then it will start to snowball in your favor. Obviously, that would be a terrible situation for those individuals. If you can only save a penny a year, you probably need to be looking at a lot of aspects of your life and figuring out what's going on, how you can improve your situation. But again, I just kind of want to highlight the point of, even if it's a small amount, it's worth holding on to because it can help get you out of this situation. And again, it kind of snowballs throughout these situations, which is like if you're spending so much money on food that you can't really afford, then you're basically getting low in your bank account, and then you're kind of getting like these overdraft fees, and then you have to get payday loans to kind of like pay some of these bills and other stuff that you kind of overdrafted on, and it kind of spirals out again. And so if you can just kind of curb them a little bit to try to minimize how often this happens, and if you can switch from one of these things happening to a couple times a month to like once a month or every couple months, that could be enough for you to start getting out of this cycle. So again, I would encourage anyone, I know that's a very tough situation to be in, and sometimes folks can kind of give up at that point and think it's not worth it, but know that if you do a little bit of effort, well, it's not a little bit of effort, if you do a lot of effort up front, this is one of those things where things can work in your favor and compound positively for you, and it will help your future self, even if it's just a penny, even if it's a dime, even if it's $1.
Expensive. Most landlords require a security deposit between $500 and $1,000 to move in, an impossible sum for people barely scraping by. And in that case, your only option other than homelessness might be a low-end extended stay motel, which typically don't require deposits, but cost way more than an apartment in the long run. And they often lack amenities like kitchen appliances and laundry that save apartment dwellers time and money.
On the housing one, this is definitely something where I think we've covered this before, but if you have family that you can stay with, that should definitely be something you should be considering if you're in one of these scenarios. That can help set you up so much better. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that like you live with somebody and mooch off of them because you know them. Like you could still potentially pay them some rent over some time, but you could potentially save a lot of money by living with somebody else, whether that's family or otherwise. You could also find roommates. I've also seen some scenarios where people basically rent out like a room in a home for pretty cheap because you're basically just renting that small square footage in comparison, and then you have kind of more shared spaces like kitchens and bathrooms, etc. And again, this could be where you could drastically reduce your cost. And again, for the people who are likely in this situation, which I hope very few or as many to none who are watching this are in that scenario, but if you're in that scenario, that's definitely not something you want to be in for a long time. And I think this is where I see some people who kind of fight this stereotype of like, they don't want to be seen as struggling, or they don't want to kind of like feel like they are kind of failing themselves or others. And so they kind of try to push for things that they can't really have. And this is where like you should be looking into those cheaper areas to live, maybe living with somebody else, maybe finding roommates, maybe renting a room. And some of these situations where this happens, I also see people who have like kids or things like that, and they'll say, oh, I have to live in an apartment with like 2 bedrooms or something like that. It has to be that way, or it has to have these things in it. And they're not willing to concede, and then it pushes them farther and farther into these problems. And it's much better off, again, to kind of like say, you know what, times are tough. I'm going to really go as bare bones as I possibly can, and maybe rent it out like that for like a year. Like maybe just get a single bedroom in a home, and you and your small child, hopefully at that point, can live in that space. It's not going to be pleasant. You're not going to love it. Maybe it's with a loved one or a family member or a friend, and you can get through that timing. And then maybe year 2 or year 3, that gives you enough money that you can start to slowly get out of these issues and then start to upgrade. But again, I think that's one of the biggest things that I'd recommend is look into alternatives. This can be one of the largest expenses for people is their renting. And again, I see a lot of people who fall into these issues of like, they feel like they can't take a step back. This can actually be in the way of their eventual success.
Say time is money, and the less money you have, the more time you have to spend on everyday tasks. Waiting at the bus stop, waiting at the laundromat, waiting at overcrowded clinics and public offices. This leaves much less free time to take care of one's family, pick up extra work, or strategize a way out of poverty.
It gets worse. Inflation, the general increase in prices, tends to hit things like food, gas, and rent the hardest. The lower your income, the greater percentage of it goes to these costs. So a poor person will see their year-over-year expenses go up at a higher rate than a wealthy person.
All these pressures take a toll on one's psyche that only makes things worse. Imagine having to constantly make tough decisions about where to spend your last few dollars. Pay the water bill or buy food for dinner. Put gas in the car or see the doctor. This relentless burning of mental energy leads to a deterioration in the quality of one's judgment, a phenomenon psychologists call decision fatigue. It's why someone might visit a payday lender when they know it's a bad idea. They're so exhausted that they'll settle for a quick fix, even if it will lead to more problems down the road.
Closely related to decision fatigue is the scarcity trap, which is our tendency to fixate on the resources that we have the least of, to the point that we lose sight of the big picture. Running low on diapers, for instance, can create a feeling of panic that compels a poor mother to buy 6 months worth of Huggies, only to realize afterwards that she didn't set aside enough money for rent.
Some might think that poor people just need to work harder and spend smarter. While it's true that improving your financial situation requires these things, it also requires having at least a little bit of extra cash to move around and access to decent spending options.
If you can't choose where you shop, where you live, or where you bank, you become a captive customer to predatory businesses. If you don't have any extra money to save or invest or budget, you can't make a financial plan. And when are you supposed to think about tomorrow when you're constantly putting out today's fires?
Next time you describe yourself as broke, remember that having just a little bit of wiggle room is infinitely better than having none at all. It can make all the difference if you're trying to improve your financial situation.
So, if you do have that wiggle room, be thankful and don't waste it.
And that's our 2 cents. Missing one payment can quickly spiral into a pit of debt. Has this ever happened to you? And were you able to escape it? Share your story in the comments.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed what you saw, please hit like or subscribe. I'll see you around.